Continuing with the treatment of symbols of Freemasonry, they have a claim concerning the well-known symbol for Masons you've probably seen on a lot of automobile bumpers. The letter G inside a compass and square. There's more than a few problems here. The first is there's no reason, aside from paranoid imagination, to think there's some hidden meaning. Another is that despite Fairley's claim, Pike doesn't say that the sexual union could be represented by the letter G. As you can see from this quote in context, he's referring to what he calls the animating spirit or fire as being represented by the letter G. The animating spirit or fire is also what's most likely pictured in this sample Fairley shows, not a sun god as he claims. I mean, seriously folks, when was the last time you saw a sun god with a smiley face? This is not the only time Fairley will try to impose sex into the picture when the Masons he quotes refer to male and female as active forces in nature. While we might find that sort of symbolism weird, it's not a code for sex. In fact, it reflects a concept that transcends gender in its most physical form. What the Masons refer to here is no different in concept, as Fairley rightly notices, than the yin and yang symbol. It would be just as foolish to look at the yin and yang symbol and think it was some sort of code for pornography. In reality, Fairley has it backwards. It should be said that the sexual union is one thing that represents what yin and yang stand for, not the other way around. Now back to some more general lessons about symbols. As we saw previously, Fairley sometimes picks and chooses from a larger symbol to create a different one. So it's cheating when Fairley says the Mason's compass is nothing more than the satanic hexagram with some key pieces removed. Well, if it has key pieces removed, it's not the satanic hexagram. To illustrate the folly of this, let's play a game with Fairley's own logo for the Fuel Project. Did you notice that at the center of his logo it's made to look like a flame with 3 points? Well, that's the face of the devil, laughing at you from the fires of hell. You can see it has 2 horns like Satan does. Then have a look at what happens when you rearrange the letters in the name of Fairley's project. That's with key pieces removed. Based on this, I could conclude that Fairley's Fuel Project is actually a secret plot by Satan to get you to reject the help of God. Better stop paying attention now before Fairley slaps a trio of 6s on your forehead. Speaking of a trio of 6s, let's notice this claim. You may wonder what this means for the flag of Israel, since the Star of David is a hexagram. Fairley will discuss his views later in Part 60. I've seen a conspiracy theorist give the excuse that the Masonic hexagram is different because it interlocks, while the Jewish Star of David overlaps. In practical terms, that's not really a difference. The appearance of overlapping in the Star of David is just an artifact of the way it's presented on Israel's flag in one color. Most Jewish renditions of the Star of David show it to be interlocking, like this one. So Fairley has a problem here. Does he think the Jews are the mark of the beast? We'll see what he says later, and it's not quite that bad, but it's bad enough. But what about this idea of the hexagram representing 666? I checked for any indication of this, and the earliest I can find it is 1968. There might be some earlier references, but if Fairley wants us to think the hexagram is the mark of the beast, he's going to have to find them, and find them a lot earlier. Fairley also shows us a picture of what he says is a Masonic hexagram and says, I'm going to ignore this claim though, because I found the same picture on a conspiracy website, and it doesn't say where it got the picture from. So I don't consider that sufficient proof that Fairley has uncovered a genuine Masonic symbol. Maybe he has, but he'll need to document it a lot better than this. Fairley next claims that checkered floors, as used by Masons, are reflective of some sort of evil plot. He goes off the rails when he draws from these floor designs the idea that good and evil or light and dark coming from the same source is a satanic concept. But where does he get the idea that the checked floors mean light and dark come from the same source? Because they're both represented on the floor? That's like saying if you have a depiction of the temptation of Jesus, showing Jesus and the devil, you're saying that Jesus and the devil come from the same source. Albert Pike, whom Fairley quotes regarding checked floors, doesn't say any such thing. What Pike does describe is a sort of dualism, like was believed by the Zoroastrians, who thought that light and dark, good and evil, came from 2 different sources that were constantly at odds. It's not Christianity, to be sure, but it's also not Satanism. What about the pentagram as a Masonic symbol? Masons freely acknowledge that this is so, and their explanation is that they distinguish it from other forms of the 5-pointed star and ascribe their own meaning to it, namely that it has to do with 5 points of fellowship. What about Fairley's attempt to connect it to the satanic pentagram? All we've said before about drawing such conclusions from symbols applies just as much here. In fact, there's a parallel between the respective Native American and Nazi uses of the swastika. The Satanists are actually latecomers when it comes to using the pentagram. A picture Fairley uses of Baphomet associated with the pentagram isn't known until the 19th century, which is also when the pentagram started becoming associated with evil thanks to a fellow named Eliphas Levi. Next up for Fairley is the double-sided Masonic apron, and here once again I'm going to begin with some doubts because Fairley doesn't say where he got his picture from. Curiously, the closest thing I find shows that what he designates as the back side of a Masonic apron with skull and bones is actually the front side of the apron of a specific group within the Masons called the Knights Templar. The reason for the skull and bones symbol is explained by one Masonic source in these terms. I'd like to ask if Fairley can document his own answer. If he can't, then he doesn't pass the symbols test we offered previously. Next up is another reference to Albert Pike. But what was it Fairley thinks Pike cuts to the chase about here? What Pike did was remark on the incredible irony that a being that blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls is also called a light bearer. And he's got a good point. As we saw back in my first vids, I happen to think that the references to Lucifer in Isaiah and Ezekiel aren't actually about Satan. But that's another issue. Fairley then offers extensive quotes from a few sources. The first is the prominent New Ager Alice Bailey. I can't help but wonder about the incongruity of Fairley quoting as authoritative someone who he believes channeled a demonic spirit, and who also twists the words of Jesus to her own purposes. If she's willing to do that, why not ask if she also twisted the works and symbols of Masons? But even without that, this is another area where Fairley should have checked his quotes. He says these three quotes come from Bailey's externalization of the hierarchy. But only one of these quotes, this last one, can be found in Bailey's book, and even in that version used by Fairley, it's not complete. In between those ellipses, Bailey speaks of the Masonic fraternity as needing to get with the program. You'll also note that Bailey speaks of the program to start around 1940. I suppose we must have missed that one. The next problem has to do with this second quote. The first part actually comes from Pike's Moral and Dogmas, not Bailey. The second part of the quote is from a slightly different work by Pike, Morals and Dogma of the Scottish Rite Craft Degrees. It's hard to decide what Pike means by these mysteries since he doesn't define them. As for that first quote, well, I don't find it anywhere, but it's definitely not in Bailey's book referred to by Fairley. That leaves us with two more quotes. One is from Henry Ridgely Evans, but Fairley doesn't say what we're supposed to conclude from this quote, so I'm not sure what his point is. I don't doubt that the Masons have included a bunch of esoteric lore in their rituals, as Evans says, but what's this supposed to prove in the larger picture? I'd ask the same of the quote from Anton LaVey, the founder of modern Satanism, who refers to influential people being Masons. That may be true, but so what? Besides, LaVey wasn't any sort of scholar or historian, and I can't imagine why Fairley thinks he ought to be taken at his word. That leaves a YouTube video where Fairley says a Freemason named Bob Rosland actually admits to worshipping Lucifer. I think he's actually fallen for Rosland's satire, and that Rosland starts out by pulling the chain of the interviewer, who he thinks is annoying him with stupid questions. If you watch the vid, you'll notice that Rosland actually claims to be Lucifer himself, and plays dumb like Homer Simpson when told about a common quote from Jesus. He's also clearly being sarcastic when he says he's been too busy to be called Worshipful Master. Rosland sounds like a guy I know who used to drive away Jehovah's Witnesses by saying he was a Satanist. And after so many years of dealing with the sort of preposterous claims Fairley makes, I can understand why he'd do that to the interviewer. This vid gets only a quarter tank.